Welcome to a journey beyond the pages of the Bible you know. Today, we're stepping into a realm of hidden truths, forgotten texts, and divine revelations that have been veiled for centuries. The story you thought you knew about Cain, Abel, and the first murder is far more than a tale of human failure. It's a window into a cosmic war that began before time itself. If you're ready to question what you've been taught and uncover the deeper truths of God's Word, stay with us. This is not just a story, it's a divine appointment. Let's begin. We all know the story. The first two brothers, the two offerings, and the first murder. We have been taught it was a simple, tragic tale of human jealousy. Genesis forewarns Cain that sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. But have you ever stopped to ask, what if that crouching entity had a name? What if it wasn't just a metaphor for human weakness, but a specific ancient intelligence? What you are about to discover will challenge everything you've been told about the first family. The story of Cain and Abel is not the beginning of mankind's fall, but the continuation of a spiritual war that started long before the Garden of Eden. An ancient text deliberately kept out of our modern Bible contains a chilling account of this conflict, a truth that was deemed too dangerous for the faithful to know. This isn't just a historical debate. Understanding what truly happened in that field between the two brothers redefines our understanding of spiritual warfare and the very nature of the enemy. It reveals that the first human family was not just a family. It was the first battleground. The forces that rebelled in the heavens did not give up after their fall. Instead, they set their sights on God's new creation. If you have ever felt that there are deeper truths waiting to be uncovered in God's Word, then you are in the right place. Join us as we pull back the veil on this forgotten chapter of human history. Let us know in the comments if you've ever questioned the traditional telling of this story. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because the truth we are about to reveal was hidden for a reason. The official account in Genesis is startlingly brief. It tells us God had regard for Abel's offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Have you ever wondered why? The scriptures offer no clear explanation. We are left with a void, a missing piece of the story that has puzzled theologians for centuries. It seems too simple that mere jealousy could ignite the world's first murder. Something deeper, something more ancient was at play in that field. The answer, it turns out, was deliberately left out. The clue has been hiding in plain sight. In Genesis 4 verse 7, God warns Cain, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door." We have been taught that sin is a metaphor, an internal struggle. But the original Hebrew word used here paints a picture of a predator, a specific entity lying in wait. What if this was not a metaphor at all? What if God was warning Cain about a real intelligent presence that was stalking him? A being that had its own agenda. To understand this, we must look to a time before man. The book of Job gives us a stunning glimpse into this pre-Adamic world. In chapter 38, God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation, while the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Who were these sons of God who witnessed creation? They were not human. They were celestial beings present long before the Garden of Eden was ever formed. The Bible confirms a reality, an order, and a history that precedes our own. And within that ancient history, there was a rebellion, a war, a fall from grace described in passages like Isaiah 14. They watched as God created a new world and a new being in his own image, man. And they saw an opportunity. They saw a new battleground. The conflict that began in the heavens was not over. It was simply waiting for a door to be opened on earth. Cain, the firstborn of humanity, was standing right in front of that door. The silence in Genesis is where the secret lies. For thousands of years, we have been left to wonder why God rejected Cain's offering. But the answer was not lost. It was hidden. In a text known as the Book of Jubilees, an ancient work once considered sacred by many, the missing piece of the puzzle is revealed. This text, deliberately excluded from our modern Bible, dares to explain what Genesis only hints at. It tells us that the rejection of Cain's offering had nothing to do with the fruits of the soil, but everything to do with the unseen spiritual forces at play. According to this forgotten account, a powerful entity was at work, an ancient intelligence known as Mastema, the chief of the spirits that survived the pre-Adamic judgment. The book of Jubilees describes how this being, an enemy of God's new creation, saw in Cain an opportunity, a gateway. It suggests that Mastema influenced Cain, tainting not just his heart with envy, but the very offering he brought before the Lord. It was an act of spiritual sabotage designed to corrupt humanity from its very first generation. God did not reject Cain. He rejected the defilement that had attached itself to him. Suddenly, God's warning in Genesis 4 takes on a terrifying new meaning. Sin is crouching at your door. This was not a poetic metaphor for a bad feeling. It was a literal divine warning. God was telling Cain that a specific predator, a named adversary from the fallen angelic order, was lying in wait for him. The crouching entity had a name, and its name was Mastema. Cain was not just fighting jealousy. He was the target in. So why was this profound truth removed? Why would the early church fathers and council leaders choose to omit a text that clarifies the first spiritual battle on earth? The reason is as simple as it is unsettling. Complicated the narrative. It was easier to teach a doctrine of simple human failure, of original sin born solely from man's weakness, than to explain a complex demonic strategy that began before Adam. They chose a simpler story, but in doing so, they hid a vital truth about the nature of our enemy. A truth that reveals the first family was never alone. They were the first battleground. To truly grasp what happened in that field, we must look far back. Before the 6 days of creation described in Genesis, before the earth was formless and void, there was a previous age, an epoch of celestial beings and divine light. Texts like the book of Job hint at this time when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. This was the primordial order, a reality populated by powerful spiritual entities who witnessed the very foundation of the universe. They were the firstborn of creation. But this celestial harmony was broken by a rebellion. A great war erupted in the heavens, not of flesh and blood, but of will and worship. A powerful archon, driven by pride, sought to usurp the throne of the Almighty and was cast down along with a third of the heavenly host. But they were not annihilated. They were exiled, becoming wandering spirits, disembodied forces filled with a bitter hatred for the Creator and His works. Their leader, a formidable intelligence known in the book of Jubilees as Mastema, the chief of these spirits, began to plot his revenge. When God formed Adam from the dust, it was more than an act of creation. It was a direct challenge to these fallen powers. Humanity, made in God's image, was given dominion over the earth, the very realm the exiled spirits now ruled. They saw mankind not as a new neighbor, but as a usurper, a target. The spiritual war that began in the heavens now had a new front, the heart of man. Cain, the first human born into this world, became their first strategic objective. He was the gateway through which their ancient rebellion could enter God's new creation. And this is the devastating truth that was deliberately obscured. The omission of texts like Jubilees was not an accident. It was a strategic choice. It is far simpler to teach that man is inherently flawed than to explain that he is the target of an ancient, organized, and intelligent enemy. By reducing the story of Cain to mere human jealousy, the early church leaders effectively hid the enemy's playbook. They taught us to wrestle with ourselves, but they failed to warn us that there is an ancient adversary, a crouching predator, whose sole purpose is to aid in our fall. For centuries, the story has been presented as a simple human tragedy, a lesson in jealousy. The version we are taught in Sunday school is clean, direct, and places the blame squarely on the shoulders of a flawed man. But the account in the book of Jubilees paints a far more complex and terrifying picture. It reveals that Cain was not just fighting his own envy. He was the primary target in a cosmic war. This is the conflict in the narrative, human weakness versus a targeted demonic assault. Why were we only given the simpler, more comfortable version? The answer lies in the monumental task faced by the early church fathers. They were forging a unified faith in a world filled with competing Gnostic gospels, pagan myths, and spiritual confusion. They needed a clear, unambiguous doctrine. The concept of original sin as a flaw inherited from Adam's disobedience was a powerful and straightforward teaching. It explained humanity's fallen state in a way that was easy to grasp and defend. Introducing an ancient named entity like Mastema, a chief of fallen spirits, actively sabotaging the first family, complicated everything. It opened doors to questions they feared would lead the faithful astray. During the Great Councils, where the biblical canon was debated and finalized, difficult choices were made. Men of deep faith and prayer decided which texts would guide Christianity for all time. Books like Jubilees, though respected and read for centuries, were deemed too complex, too esoteric. They were set aside not necessarily because they were considered false, but because they were considered dangerous for a young and growing church. The leaders chose to protect the flock from what they perceived as confusing or frightening truths, opting for a streamlined narrative that emphasized man's responsibility and God's simple plan for redemption. But this act of protection, however well-intentioned, came at a great cost. In shielding the faithful from a complex truth, they inadvertently hid the enemy's strategy. They taught us to look for sin only within our own hearts. But they removed the warning that an ancient predator is crouching just outside the door. By omitting the role of Mastema, they deprived generations of believers of a critical piece of spiritual intelligence. What you are rediscovering tonight is not an attack on the foundations of our faith, but the restoration of a lost chapter. Perhaps the early church fathers were right. Perhaps the faithful of that time were not prepared for such a heavy truth. But you are. The fact that you are watching this, that you have sought out these deeper answers, suggests a spiritual maturity ready to look beyond the simplified stories. In these times when deception is rampant, God is pulling back the veil for those with eyes to see. He is restoring knowledge that was once deemed too dangerous, equipping his people for a battle that is intensifying every day. Have you ever felt that modern Christianity sometimes feels shallow? That the answers given for the deep struggles of the soul are not enough? This is why we have been taught to fight a battle against sin, as if it is only a personal flaw, when the scriptures and the texts hidden from us reveal we are contending with ancient intelligent adversaries. We have been taught to wrestle with ourselves, but we were never told the full story of the enemy crouching at our door. This knowledge is not meant to create fear, but to bring clarity. It reframes your spiritual life. You are not just a flawed person trying to be good. You are a child of the Most High God born onto a battlefield. And understanding the enemy's original strategy to corrupt humanity from its very first generation is the key to understanding the victory that was secured for us and the authority we now walk in. The story of Cain is not just history. It is a vital piece of spiritual intelligence for the believer today. But if you thought the story stopped with Mastema and Cain, you have only scratched the surface. The battle for the heart of the first family was not the beginning of the war on earth. It was just one campaign in a conflict that is far older than humanity itself. The Garden of Eden, which we see as the perfect beginning, may have been something else entirely. A restoration, a divine reclamation project on a world that had already seen a catastrophic spiritual war. Think about the language in Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Have you ever asked why? Why would a perfect creator begin with a world already in a state of chaos and darkness? Some ancient rabbinic traditions and whispers within apocryphal texts suggest this was not the original state. They speak of a previous age, a primordial earth filled not with darkness but with a divine light, a creation before our own, populated by those very sons of God who shouted for joy. This was the world that witnessed the great rebellion. The war that cast Lucifer and his legions down did not happen in a sterile, empty heaven. Discard creation itself. The formless and void state of the earth may not have been its starting point, but the aftermath of that first devastating war. The darkness was not an absence of light, but the presence of a fallen power. This means Eden was not Plan A. It was God's holy beachhead established on enemy-occupied territory. And this raises an even more profound question. If there was a world of light before Adam, what was it like? What secrets does that forgotten age hold? The conflict between Cain and Abel was a fight for the future of humanity. But now we must ask, what was the fight for the memory of Earth's true past? The truth of what our world once was has been buried deeper than any other secret. This is the critical key that unlocks the entire Bible. God is not just the creator who watched his perfect world fall. He is the great restorer who stepped into a realm already scarred by rebellion and began to reclaim it. The 6 days of creation were not the first chapter of history, but the first chapter of a divine recovery mission. Eden was not a fragile paradise waiting to be broken. It was a fortress of light established in a land shrouded by an ancient darkness. This changes the very meaning of our existence. Why was man created? We were not an afterthought. We were the answer. When the highest of all angelic beings declared he would be like the Most High, God's response generations later was to create a being of dust and breath in his own image and give him dominion. You were created as a living testament to God's authority. Humanity was and still is God's master stroke in this ancient cosmic war. Does this knowledge threaten your faith, or does it deepen it? For centuries, we have been told a story that begins with our failure. But the truth is, the story begins with God's victory in a war we never knew about. This hidden history does not diminish the story of redemption. It magnifies it. It reveals a God whose wisdom is so profound that his plan for our salvation was also the final answer to a rebellion that began before the foundations of the world were laid. This is the truth that was deemed too dangerous. Not because it destroys faith, but because it demands a stronger one. It calls us to see beyond a simple story of a garden and a fall and to understand our place in a conflict that spans ages. It reveals that your personal struggles are not random. They are echoes of this ancient war. And your faith is not just a personal belief. It is a declaration of allegiance to the King who is reclaiming all things. And so we arrive at the final, most profound truth. The one that ties all these hidden threads together. If God knew about the ancient rebellion, if he established Eden on a world already scarred by spiritual war, then his plan for humanity was never a fragile experiment. It was a masterstroke. The redemption of mankind was not a reaction to the fall in the garden. That is where the plan was revealed, but not where it was conceived. The plan is far older than Adam. It is older than time itself. Look again at Genesis. But with this new understanding, when God speaks to the serpent in the garden in chapter 3:15, he makes a promise. He foretells of a seed of the woman who would one day crush the serpent's head. For centuries, we have seen this as Plan B, a divine response to an unforeseen tragedy. But it was not. This was the moment God unveiled a piece of Plan A. He was not creating a new strategy. He was activating a protocol that had been in place since before the foundations of the world were laid. The Apostle Paul confirms this in his letter to the Ephesians, declaring that God chose us in him before the creation of the world. The book of Revelation speaks of the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. This is the ultimate secret. The coming of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice, and his victory were not a rescue mission designed after Adam sinned. It was the preordained definitive counteroffensive designed to utterly defeat the ancient rebellion of Mastema and his legions and to redeem a creation that God knew would be targeted. This knowledge transforms everything. Your faith is not rooted in a story of failure that God is trying to fix. Your faith is anchored in an eternal victory that was planned before the first star ever shone. You are not a descendant of a broken prototype, but a child of the Most High King, an inheritor of a perfect plan that has been unfolding across the ages. The story of Cain was not the beginning of our fall. It was one of the first revelations of a battle that had already been won in the heart of God. Let this truth settle in your spirit for a moment. The story of your faith is not small. It is not confined to a single garden or a single mistake. It is an epic spanning from a time before time. A victory declared before the first battle was ever fought on earth. You are a part of this grand narrative. A child of a king whose plan has never once faltered. Your struggles are not meaningless. They are echoes of an ancient war. But your victory was secured before the foundation of the world. For centuries, these deeper truths were sealed away, deemed too complex or too dangerous for the faithful. They were buried in forgotten texts and obscured by simpler doctrines. But we are living in a time of revelation. God is now pulling back the veil for those who have the heart to seek him, restoring the knowledge that equips his people for the days we live in. What you have discovered today was not an accident. It was an appointment. If this truth burns in your heart, please show your support by leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss these revelations. And we now have a members area. By becoming a member, you bless this work and help us continue producing uplifting, and revealing content like this. We are building a community of believers who are not afraid to look deeper. Let us know in the comments what city you are watching from so we can see how far this message is reaching. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden truths of God's Word. What you've just heard is more than a retelling of an ancient story. It's a call to awaken. The truths we've uncovered today about Cain, Mastema, and the cosmic war that shaped humanity's beginning are a reminder that you are part of a divine narrative far greater than you've been told. God's plan is not fragile. It's unstoppable. As you reflect on these revelations, ask yourself, what other truths are waiting to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and join our community of truth seekers by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. This journey is just beginning, and the next revelation is closer than you think. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and walk boldly in the victory that was won before time began.